Fine. So today we'll proceed with the research methods. The last thing we discussed 2 weeks ago was conceptual metaphor. Was it conceptual metaphor? Am I right? Okay, then I'll share my screen. Yes. We haven't taken frame analysis as yet. Yeah? No? Fine. Again, it's something we discussed with some of you when you were fourth year students. Maybe you remember it, maybe not, but there are some students who were not with us last year. That's why I'll repeat it. Yes, the year is seems too remote for you, but this is the basics, and this frame analysis is used now very actively, though the definition dates back to 1975. So frame. It is not translated as Ramka into Ukrainian, so if you write your abstract or generally an article in Ukrainian, it still will be frame. Um, so, frame is the knowledge structure which helps to perceive a definite situation. It is a stereotyped situation we keep as a file in our mind. So, the whole reality around us is segmented and represented as frames in our minds. It is not only the reality we perceived immediately from our first-hand experience, but it is also something we perceived from books, from media, from films, for instance. Obviously, at least I think that most of us have never seen a car chase, but we have this frame of car chase in our mind because we've read about it, we have seen some films about it, and like this. So this is a remembered framework to be adapted to fit reality by changing details if necessary. So our communication is possible both intracultural, when we communicate using the same language with people who share the same micro micronational experience with us, or if it is the intercultural communication. We also share some frames, and that enables our communication, though if it is an intercultural and a sample of intercultural communication, there are more differences within the frame that may lead to so-called communicative failures. Though it does not mean that if we communicate with our peers in the same language, we are safe from this communicative failure. Yeah? It is always possible because our frames are never absolutely identical. So if you translate something, what you see is this frame. Yeah? What you translate is the frame. And you can easily recognize the frame when you see its separate parts, slots. And missing elements of this frame are restored by default. So if we have a description of a situation, we do not need the detailed description because a lot of things are activated by default because they are parts of our frame. Yeah? What we typically communicate about are these slots of new information that are included in the already existing frames in our mind. So, frame is the organization of ideas kept in the memory, knowledge structure about a fragment of human experience, And it contains all types of knowledge: lexical knowledge, our knowledge about the meanings of the words; encyclopedic knowledge, like more detailed knowledge about concepts; and extralingual knowledge, which is built up by our immediate experience. Yes, by our relationship with the outer world. Yeah? Is that clear, more or less? And if you, again, if you are our graduates, the graduates of our bachelor's problem, you must remember this example. I provided it last year because I haven't found anything like more illustrative for showing how this frame analysis works. So what you have here is the application of the frame analysis to the translation analysis. Namely, this is the analysis of how we translate intertextual relations. In other words, allusions. Allusia. You understand what I mean, yeah? Reference to some literary text or reference to some historical events you see in the text. And your task as a translator is not only to translate what you have here in this immediate text, but also this reference that is actualized in the text. So intertextual, do you understand generally what I'm talking about? Алюзії, інтертекстуальність, так? Тобто ви перекладаєте уривочок якийсь тексту, де є якась алюзія, де є якийсь референс, посилання на якийсь там біблійний, міфологічний чи літературний твір, чи якусь історичну подію, так? І в перекладі ви перекладаєте не тільки цей горизонтальний контекст, а також цей вертикальний контекст, яким чином ця алюзія інтерпретується в цьому новому тексті. So, intertextual relations are the interaction between cognitive structures that contain information about one-time and recurring situations from individual human experience, finding similar indexes in the already existing cognitive structures, which supplies resources to interpret new information. In simple terms, what you have is a text written some time ago, which is cross-mapped onto the new text. And in this new text, it, on the one hand, preserves the meaning it had in the proto-text, but on the other hand, it is reinterpreted. It acquires some new senses. It changes some nuances of meaning. It adheres some pieces of new information. So, this cognitive structure that stores an episode from a certain text in our mind is a prototextual frame. So, prototextual frame is our knowledge about the proto-text where this allusion was used for the first time, or rather where this allusion is borrowed from. And the text we translate where this allusion is activated and interpreted is a metatextual frame. So as a result, we may view intertextuality as the result of cross-mapping between this prototextual original frame and metatextual frame, where this allusion is reinterpreted and used in the new surroundings. Is this clear from the theoretical viewpoint, more or less? Yeah. And now you have an example. An example is taken from Great Gatsby. If you haven't read the book, you must have seen the film, maybe with Leonardo DiCaprio. So, Do you remember that he was in love with a girl and he actually put all his mental, financial, and physical resources into winning her back? And he failed as a result, but it doesn't matter for this small extract we are going to analyze. So the sentence sounds like this. He had intended probably to take what he could and got, but now he found that he had committed himself to the following of a grail. He knew that Daisy was extraordinary, but he didn't realize just how extraordinary a nice girl could be. So following a grail, what is important here? What is this prototextual frame? It is connected with a grail. So what is the prototextual frame? Let's recall it. Have you ever heard about grail? Yes, so what is it? What is the prototextual frame of this grail? The frame that exists in your mind, because with some people it is more detailed, those who are fond of the cycle it is taken from. For the British people, it may be more complete than for you because it is taken from the British folklore and literature, early British folklore and literature. But what is your prototextual frame as Grail is concerned? Please, anyone? Or it doesn't exist? I think you must have at least heard about it. Please. Yeah? Anyone? So no one has?
It's said about the cup that is believed to have been used by Jesus Christ at the meal before his death.
Papa, you mean? Yeah, that's right. And Vasil, that's a good.
Yeah, also,
let's proceed.
Yeah, also from the literature, it's an important motive of Arthurian era literature of that time. Like something very important, something very expensive, and often unattainable.
Yes, that's right. Important, unattainable, and also the source of eternal life and eternal happiness. Yeah? It is believed that there was this cup used by Jesus during the Holy Supper, and when you find the Grail, you can attain this eternal youth and life and happiness. And you are right to mention the cycle of the Round Table and King Arthur, because there was one knight pursuing this goal. Do you remember the name of the knight? Sir Percival. Yeah? There are some well-known knights like Lancelot, but there is also Sir Gawain, and there is also Sir Percival, whose main purpose was to find this Holy Grail. Yeah? And as you see, in the Ukrainian translations, we don't have Grail, maybe because judging by your activity while I asked this question, it is not the frame that is so much widespread in the Ukrainian lingual picture of the world. Yeah, maybe it is more even more known now than in the past when I was young, because now we have some films about this Grail. We have more information about it. And in some 20, 30 years ago, it was not that popular. It has never been discussed in detail. There were very few references to it in literature. That's why in these translations we have, like translation by Mark Pinchevsky, «Виявило, прирік себе на довічне служіння дамі серця», and in Alexander Mokrovoyski's translation, whose translations are typically very user-friendly, with a lot of allowances made for the target reader. It seems that the translator thinks that his readers have the mind of the 5-year-old kids, Though translations are good, but they are very simplified. So it's just довічне служіння святим. So everything is neutralized. And now you can see how it works with the frames and slots, etc. So in each frame, we have components. We have actors or doers of the actions. We have instruments sometimes. We have goals. We have objects of the goal. It depends on what frame you have in a particular instance. And what is the prototextual frame? Who are the actors? Actually, we have one actor, that is Sir Percival, but we might generalize it knights. The goal is to follow something, to find something, the search for something. The goal object is the grail, which is the cup of Jesus Christ, but Christ is, of less importance here. What is really important is this eternal life, is all the benefits you can have if you find the grail. And goal object feature, this is what is really important, a source of eternal happiness, abundance and life, and it is unattainable. You're quite right, Vasil, in this respect. And what do we have in the metatextual frame? The actor is J. Gatsby. Again, he follows something. His goal object is Daisy, who is associated with the grail. But by the way, we should pay attention to the article here. It is not the grail capitalized and definite article. It is a grail. It is smaller, but it is something like a grail. If you have article a preceding the proper noun, it implies that it functions as a simile, as a comparison, and that is what we have here. And what are the new slots that appear as a result of this mapping of the prototextual frame and metatextual frame? Actors feature J. Gatsby. J. Gatsby is associated with a knight, but not a real knight. We know that real knights were rude, violent, and not that much chivalry as we tend to perceive them. But this ideal imaginary knight. And his object is a source of eternal happiness, and it is also unattainable. So we have a hint here that he will not find his happiness. He will not get her back, and there won't be a happy end. Yeah, it is already a hint you can find in this comparison. It's a kind of the preempting of the finale of this novel. And what we have in the prototextual frame Ukrainian, yes, so it's the same, actually, doesn't matter whether it is in English or in Ukrainian, but what we have in the translation by Mark Pinchevsky, Служіння дамі серця, it's very similar, because Dama Serce is from the night cycles, and Grail is from the night cycles, and Dama Serce is very often associated with the cup. If you read Dan Brown, you must remember it, that the cup is a woman. Yeah. That's why it is believed that this idea of the grail was later transformed into the image of the dame. Yeah. That's just a transformation. That's why the translator is not that far from the original intention. Because if you remember the legends about knights and their dames, dames are usually married. They cannot, so they do not believe, knights do not expect to marry them, they just serve them. Yeah, and that's all. And all this is actualized in this metatextual frame, and we have this idea in the new slots. So that was just an example how this frame analysis may work. So if you analyze something, you may have these prototextual frames, metatextual frames, both in the original and the translation, and then you can see how this cross-mapping works. Is that clear? Yes. So we can move on to something absolutely different, and this is the contrastive method. You know that our department is the Department of Translation Studies and Contrastive Linguistics, though we do not pay that much attention to contrastive linguistics. Our major specialist in contrastive linguistics is Professor Nagieva Andreichuk. She is responsible for this second wing of our activity. But even if you do if you do translation analysis, it is worth starting, not always, but in some situations, depending on the topic of your research, depending on the object of your research, it's worth starting with the contrastive analysis. For instance, the researchers from our departments, such as Ольга Сергіївна Грабовецька, Оксана Орестівна Молчко. Ольга Сергіївна wrote about epithet constructions and Oksana Orestівna about simile constructions. But the first part of their research was the contrastive analysis of English and Ukrainian epithets and simile constructions respectively. And then they moved on to the translation analysis. So this is sometimes a very good first step in this direction. So what is contrastive method? First of all, you should understand that the terms contrastive analysis and comparative analysis are not synonyms. They are different. I won't say absolutely different, but there is a very important difference between them. And the difference is, the major difference is, that if it is comparative analysis, you look for similarities. Yeah? When comparative analysis was created, its main purpose was to compare the languages, cognate languages, to restore the proto-language. This is the main purpose of comparative analysis, to look for similarities, convergent features of cognate languages. While contrastive method contrast both cognate and non-cognate languages. You know the term cognate, by the way, yeah? Споріднені, неспоріднені. Yeah? So it doesn't matter whether these languages are cognate or non-cognate, because we use contrastive method to contrast English and Ukrainian, and they are not cognate languages. Yeah? So it is a totality of procedures, and it aims to find similarities. Something got wrong. Yeah, a totality of procedures, description of the language through its systemic comparison in order to find the specificity, in order to find the divergent features, differences. This is what contrastive analysis is about. And it is used to contrast both cognate, non-cognate languages, aims to determine differences between these languages synchronically. Do you understand the word synchronically? What is that? Unlike diachronical. Okay? I'm sure that you know it. Just speak up. No, synchronia, diachronia. Diachronically means the historical perspective. And synchrony is the current stage of things. That's all. So you compare the languages, either cognate or non-cognate, at a given stage of their development. This given stage of their development is, in the majority of cases, current development. But you may also compare the languages of, for instance, Middle English and Middle Ukrainian. It will also be the synchronic analysis. So the analysis of the languages at a certain stage of their development. Okay, and similarities in the contrastive method are usually disregarded because the focus is on the differences. And there are three statements about the contrastive method. The first is idiomatic character of the language. It is not about idioms, phraseological units. It is about the specificity of the language. Each language is specific systemically. So the systems of the languages are different. It's not only the case that we have, I don't know, S in the third person singular in English. This is a minor feature. There is a difference between languages as systems. Like English is more analytical, Ukrainian is more synthetical, English has more developed system of aspects, so we analyze it from the point of view of the system. So systemic character of all levels of the language, phonological, morphological, syntactic, and the language as a whole. That's why contrastive analysis is not about random facts. You have systemic binary oppositions at different levels. Like you compare these languages, for instance, at the phonological level. Then you may compare them at the level of idioms, realia. So you may take any lexical feature, or it may be morphological feature, the system of affixes in English and Ukrainian, and what is the difference in general. You do not focus on the specific affix. Yeah. But in general, you state that as Ukrainian language is more synthetic, it has a very developed system of suffixes, diminutive, augmentatives, etc., etc. English also has some diminutive suffixes, but it's not the regular feature. Yeah. And that is how you compare the languages. That is how you contrast them. That's why you do it according to the levels. Phonological level, it is called diaphony. Yeah. Grammatical ones, diamorph, semantical one, diasemy, and lexical one, dialexic. So this dia implies that you analyze the differences, systemic differences between the languages. Is that clear? Yeah, this is what contrastive analysis is about. This is a very general fact, but I think that this is a good foundation you can proceed from if you want to analyze it and discuss it more in detail. Yeah, and as contrastive analysis of English and Ukrainian is concerned, yeah, because it's very good to discuss it in general, but what we are interested in is the binary opposition of these two languages, English and Ukrainian. And the best specialists in this field are the people I mentioned here. These are Ukrainian scholars, like Yartseva. She is the author of the contrastive grammar of the two languages. And also, maybe you've heard this name, Professor Yuri Alexeyevich Zhluktenko. We have, at our department, we have a methodological workshop named after Professor Zhluktenko. So Professor Zhluktenko was the best specialist in contrastive linguistics in English and Ukrainian binary opposition, and he was the first to develop contrastive lexicology of English and Ukrainian. There are a lot of books of his and also articles where he discusses these problems. And though it may seem that they were written long ago, in the early 90s, late 80s, but as the theoretical foundation, they are still the best in this binary opposition. Yes, Vasil?
Yes, I wanted just to clarify, for example, if we want to use this contrasting method in our any researches, we are not obliged to use all four of these levels. We can just use one or two of them, which are important in our case, yes? Or
You use what is relatable to the topic of your research, that's all. Yeah.
okay.
You don't need everything, yeah? But if it is Lexis, I recommend that you find Жлуктенко's article «Контрастивна лексикологія». Я ніколи назв не пам'ятаю, але слово «контрастивна лексикологія» точно є. Там дві крапки, і він далі це все уточнює. Тому що там дуже все детально розкладено, на яких ви підрівнях це аналізуєте. Там є приклади, частина з них вже, може, застаріла, бо воно написано в 89-му році, якщо я не помиляюсь. But it is still a very useful article as the theory is concerned. Yeah? And it is important to use something like that because you have this English-Ukrainian opposition. That is what you need Ukrainian scholars for. Yeah? But if you are interested in stylistic level, so here it is worth taking the research by our colleagues, like Associate Professor Grabovecko, Mouchko, if it is about stylistics, because they focus on stylistics. Okay, just a second. Okay. Any questions about this? No? No. So let's proceed. Something got wrong with my computer. And comparative method. I've already mentioned the difference. So comparative method is about similarities. Divergent features are either discarded or they are of minor importance. Yeah? In both cases, if it is contrastive or comparative, it doesn't mean that here you discard similarities completely. And here you discussed divergent features completely. They are somewhere in the background always, but the main focus is on the similarities. And when comparative analysis was just launched, it was only about similarities because the task was to reconstruct this proto-language. So it is connected with comparative and historical method, which is the key tool to determine the affinity between languages. And main principles of comparative analysis, procedures used are to prove the historical affinity близькість, так, and identity of words, morphemes, when it doesn't seem obvious, yeah? Because there are for sure some obvious cases like mama, which is similar in the majority of languages. Yeah? But this is when you focus on less obvious things and still you can trace down some similarities there. These procedures are identical in monolingual or bilingual plane. So if you analyze language separately or if you compare it with other languages, these procedures are based on rigid phonetic correspondences and word building paradigms. You know, If you can prove something on the phonetic level, it already means that you can easily proceed to some higher levels because you have already proved your main point. I wonder what I've heard about it, but I believe that at least some of you have heard about Yuri Shevelyov and his great discovery about the Ukrainian language. Do you know what I mean? Okay, so you know that before Shevelyov, Russian linguists who were ubiquitous, they were everywhere in the West, in particular Roman Jakobson, who, as it appears, was the agent of KGB, yeah. They promoted the idea about this общерусский язык that combine the features of Russian, Ukrainian, and Belarusian, and then the languages developed from it. The most well-developed was the Russian language, but the other two also developed from this one root, which was called общерусский язык. But Yuri Shevelyov, he wrote a lot of things. He worked in various spheres, but this is his most important achievement, that he analyzed the phonological level. By the way, his first article was not about Ukrainian, but it was about Belarus. That there was no общерусский язык. That already at the phonological level, these languages were developing separately from different dialects. So there was nothing common, no common root. There were 5 or 6 dialects. Я не знаю, чи я зараз то згадаю добре. Значить, Києво-Поліський, Києво-Подільський, Галицько-Поліський. З тих двох розвинулась українська мова. Далі Полоцько-Смоленський, це відповідно яка мова? Ну, половці це хто? І Смоленський, який зараз Росія, він до 16 століття був де?
Україні.
Ні, це була Білорусь. Тобто
Ага.
Половці – це Білорусь, і Смоленськ – це було абсолютно білоруське. Це дуже старовинна, справді, територія. Ну, москалі, звичайно, про це не згадують, але аж в кінці 16 століття вони цю територію окупували. Значить, от цей Полоцько-Смоленський, звідти розвинулась білоруська мова окремо. А російська розвинулася з діалекту, який Шевельов назвав Новгородський і далі Муромсько-Тверський ще там. Тобто 2 діалекта. З 2 діалектів розвинулась російська, з 1 діалекту білоруська, і з 2 діалектів розвинулась українська. So he proved that at the phonological level, and that was enough to prove the idea that there was no this общерусский язык. Then you can move on to morphological level, lexical level, syntactic level. But if you prove a fact on the phonological level, that is a basic level. Yeah, it is already the foundation you can move on from. Yeah. And what is very important, though Russian scholars are very much dissatisfied with this research by Shevelyov, they prefer not to mention it because they cannot prove that he was wrong. And this is already a very good sign that he was right because they just didn't mention it. They cannot disprove these facts. Okay. So the totality of these procedures help to elucidate the history of the development of a language. So that is what comparative method is about. That's why if you do the translation analysis, it is called comparative translation studies analysis. In English, it sounds maybe too long. Це перекладознавчий аналіз, до якого ви можете додати слово порівняльний. Тобто він є порівняльний, він є не контрастивний. But you may omit this word comparative, just translation studies analysis. There are 4 types of comparative translation studies analysis. You may compare originals and translations to demonstrate the degree of proximity or distance of content and structure of text. So, what is similar, what is different? The original is taken as an invariant, and you see what variant features appear in this translation. You may determine ways of reaching equivalence. You may describe various translation procedures, strategies, and other parameters of the translation process. This is the first possibility. Next is more interesting, and that is what is more required currently, yeah? Because we have this idea that the original accumulates the multiplicity of senses, and it's impossible to cover all this multiplicity in one translation. The more translations we have, the more complete this original is. That is how translation studies treats originals and possibilities of its reproducing right now. And that's why it's very interesting to compare several translations of the same source text, to find some general norms of translation, to find the specificity of reproducing a genre, and generally to see what new appears in each of these translations. Yeah? So the concept of retranslations is in the focus of translation studies right now. Yeah? In the 90s, there was even this retranslation hypothesis that the first translation is domesticated and each new translation is more, each new translation is closer to the original than the previous translation, but it is an ideal situation, and there are a lot of cases when the first or second translation was closer to the original than, say, the fourth. Yeah? If we compare, for instance, Hamlet as translated by Grigory Kochur in the 60s and Yuri Andrukhovich in the late 90s, we may say that Yuri Andrukhovich's translation is more domesticated than Grigory Kochur's translation. So this retranslation hypothesis is not something that can be applied to any situation. So that's the possibility. Yeah? Next is a comparison of translations and original text of the target culture. This is a very interesting approach, which is used more rarely. What is meant is, what I mean is that you take texts of the same genre and style and period in the 2 languages, and you compare them. So it's not original and translation. These are originals in 2 languages, but they share something in common. For instance, these are detective stories written in the 70s of the previous century, or science fiction, modern science fiction. You take Kidruk and you take somebody from the English-speaking language, and you compare these originals, you compare the features. While doing this comparison, you will see the borrowings in the majority of cases from English into Ukrainian. Yeah? The borrowings of various stylistic features, plot elements, etc., etc. But that is when you compare the originals. But definitely you should have some foundation for this comparison. So this is also a possibility. Then you can, yes, this is actually the fourth comparison of text in the source language and target language of the same functional genres, because I didn't read it attentively. What I just mentioned is the fourth comparison of text in the source language and target language of the same functional genres or styles to find discrepancies in the use of lingual stylistic means. Yeah. And the third is a bit different. This is you compare the, if you still remember what polysystem is, you compare English polysystem and Ukrainian polysystem. And polysystem is the system consisting of everything that belongs to this culture, including originals and translations. If you want to focus exclusively on translations, you analyze the translation policy, for instance, of Great Britain and the translation policy of Ukraine. What texts are selected for translation? What is done with these texts? For instance, in Ukrainian, there is this tendency when you translate poetry to reproduce the not only the content, but also the rhythm, rhyme, phonological features, while in English polysystem, sometimes they do not bother to allot so much time and effort to doing it, and they focus exclusively on the content in the majority of cases, or they produce neo-literalist versions, which are word-for-word translations. Yeah. So that is when you analyze the general translation policy at a given period. Usually it is the current period. Is that clear? So these are four main approaches to translation studies analysis you may use in your research. Or you may combine these approaches, because even if you compare the original and its translations, you should take into account the general translation tendency in the receiving culture and the translation norms in the receiving culture, so you cannot do without it. Okay, this is something I've already mentioned. If you do this analysis, it's preferable to start with pre-translation, yeah? When you focus on the texts, irrespective of what is done with these texts further. And there are two possibilities, like prescriptive, quality assurance through the corrections or errors, and descriptive, yeah? As prescriptive is concerned, this approach is already outdated. That is what Eugene Nida did. This is what German scholars did in the 70s and 80s. But starting with the late 90s up to today, the approach in translation studies analysis is descriptive. Yeah? You describe the patterns, the phenomena of translation. You deduce the motivation behind them. Even if something seems a mistranslation for you, you can deduce the motivation and you can explain why you have this deviation. Yes, sometimes it is just a blunder. It is just a mistake. It's also possible. But if it is something, if you see that it's something systematic, then it may mean that the translator had an approach that may differ from your approach and your understanding what a good translation is, but you may even give your estimation somewhere, but first of all, you should explain the strategy. You should explain the reasons behind this strategy. And that's why you should go beyond linguistic factors, but you should take into account sociological factors. You should take into account the background behind all this. Okay, and Do you remember this? We analyzed it with you when some of you were our first year students. There are a lot of possibilities to do text analysis in translation. But it is my personal opinion, obviously, but this model or scheme of translation studies analysis is most comprehensive and user-friendly. You may obviously modify it. It's just a crib, a scheme. You may modify it. But this is a very logical scheme, which may help you if you do the translation studies analysis. And it is described in Christian Nude, one of her earliest texts, because she is still an active scholar and translator. This is one of her first texts. And she already elaborated upon this analysis. Here you have the scheme you have here differs slightly from what we have in 1991, but I decided to mention the first date when she introduced this analysis. So she starts with the pre-translation analysis. So what you have here is not the analysis of the very translation and its comparison with the original. And it is also something she recommends translators should do. So it is both for translators who take the original and are ready to translate it, and it is also for researchers who already have the original and the translation and analyze them. What she starts with is the intended text functions. What is meant by the intended text functions? You analyze how the text functioned in the original, and if it is translation studies analysis, you compare its function in the translation, or at least the intended function. For instance, I think you all know The Godfather. There was this film, Oscar winner, and obviously it is based on the book by Mario Puzo that was written, I don't remember, late 50s, early 60s, approximately that time, about the Italian mafia in the United States after the Second World War. What is the intended function of Mario Puzo? Yeah. It was not that obvious, but actually he wanted to create this psychological family saga with some elements of thrillers, etc., etc. So his task was to create a bestseller, yeah, that was pretty much that included a lot of attention-compelling elements to trigger the reader's attention. And he achieved this purpose. But The Godfather was translated in the early 70s. It was translated into Ukrainian. And by the way, that was a translation into Ukrainian done before the Russian translation. And it was a very rare case. It was published in Всесвіт magazine. At that time, its editor was Dmytro Pavlichko, who did a very good job. I remember my grandfather had all these Всесвіт journals, all issues, starting from the early 60s up to the late 70s, because then suddenly it became extremely boring because that was the change of the chief editor. I think it was він потім став редактором «Огонька», українець, але зараз він жахливий русофіл і живе в Москві. I forgot his name. Again. But the main idea, it was translated, and that was a very good thing. But to translate it, it was necessary to change the intended text function. And it was explained in the preface, obviously, that this text is intended to expose the wiles of capitalist American society. That was the intended function, and that was the only possibility to publish this translation, to change its function and to reorient the readers. It doesn't mean that the readers were immediately reoriented, but at least it was an excuse, a good excuse to publish this translation. I think I've already mentioned, it concerns all postmodern texts, particularly when they just started to appear on the mass market. Umberto Eco and His Name of the Rose. This is the first postmodern text that appeared in the Soviet Union of the late perestroika epoch. So it was late 80s. What is the name of the rose? This is an extremely complicated text with a lot of references to the world culture. Like the main character is, so have you read, by the way, the text? Any one of you? Because I recommend that you do. This is my favorite text. So it is, the events took place in the Middle Ages, and a monk named whose name is Baskerville was investigating a murder in the monastery. And you may read it as a detective story without penetrating into the deeper level of senses. Because even the name of the main character is Baskerville, which is a reference to Sherlock Holmes. And the name of his disciple is very similar to that of Dr. Watson. But there are a lot of deep, profound senses there. But you may read it without penetrating into these levels. And that is what was done in the first Russian translations, because the Ukrainian translation appeared much later, already in the independent Ukraine in the late 90s. I read it in Russian, and I read it as I was a teenager back then. And I read it just as a funny text with a detective plot, though it is an extremely complicated text. And it took me much more time to read it now, some 10 years ago, when I rediscovered this text for myself. Okay, the senders and the addressees. So you analyze this aspect because it is also very important. And often the senders and the addressees are absolutely different. Obviously, if the text dates back to the 16th, 17th, 18th, or even 19th century, and you translate it now, the sender is absolutely different. When Lord Byron wrote his cycle Hebrew Melodies, he wrote it for the British Jews who wanted to put it into music and then to enjoy it during their sessions. So he was paid for that. By the way, Byron was the first English author who was paid for his writing, the first English poet. But now these poems are translated for absolutely different addressees. By the way, when Hebrew Melodies were translated into Ukrainian for the first time, and it was done 3 times in the 19th century. When there were few translations, very few translations into Ukrainian. But Hebrew Melodies were translated into Ukrainian because the translators, in particular Kostomarov, wanted to show this, this analogy. Israel, Babylon, it's like Ukraine and Russia. So the intended addressees were absolutely different. the motive, you have the motive here at the end, yeah, is absolutely different, and the intended function is absolutely different. Yeah. Obviously, we take into account the time and place of text reception, the medium, speech and writing, yeah, because sometimes the original is not written to be, for instance, to be staged. Like it is a dramatic text, seemingly dramatic text, like Byron's dramas. He indicated that this is drama for reading, it is not for staging. But all his dramas were staged later, even in Ukrainian. They were translated into Ukrainian, and then they were staged, like his Cain was staged in our Voskresenia theater. Yeah. So the medium can also be different. Okay, so that is what you analyze at this very general pre-translation level. Is that clear? And then you analyze what you typically do. It doesn't mean that you should focus on all these components. It depends on what you what is the object of your research and the aim of your research. But if you analyze translation in general, yes, you analyze the subject matter, you analyze the content, you analyze presupposition. This might be something you don't understand. By presupposition, she meant some facts of real life, which are presumed to be known to the readers. So this might be a kind of a challenge. If you have some names which are understandable for the original readers, because these names are the names of the cultural icons of these cultures or something like that. And in the translation, you should either domesticate them or explain them. So everything depends on your purpose. Then you analyze composition. Then non-verbal elements should be analyzed. You know that now the notion of multimodality is one of the key notions of translation studies. First of all, because most of you, when you write your diploma essays, prefer to focus on multimodal products now. Films, cartoons, video games, or localization of websites. So all these multimodal products imply that you will have a lot of non-verbal elements. But even if you analyze texts, sometimes non-verbal elements are also important. What is meant, like, is sometimes when you have highlighted phrases in the text, like italics or something else, or some specific structure of the text. You know, there are a lot of figurative poems in the shape of something. Maybe you have come across such poems. When the shape of a poem reflects its content. This is the postmodernistic approach to poetry. Or even if you take classical texts, like Alice in Wonderland, this text is inseparable from its illustrations. So when the text was published for the first time, there were illustrations by Tenniel, who was Lewis Carroll's friend, and these illustrations were linked to the text. They were inseparable. By the way, if we think about Alice in Wonderland, how does the Queen of Hearts look like? Queen of Hearts. Can you describe her appearance? Is she beautiful or ugly?
You mean in the film or in
I mean general. So you think about, let's think about your frames. Let's get back to frames. Your frame of Queen of Hearts from Alice in Wonderland.
So basically, she has a lot of shapes of hearts. For example, her hair is done in the shape of heart. Her makeup is all in hearts. For example, iconically, she's going to be with red colors, or for example, pink, because we associate hearts with red or pink colors. And maybe something with her clothes. I mean, not only shapes heart shapes somewhere, but also maybe some kind of a dress. So I mean, in the form of heart, something like
Okay, but that's right. Is she beautiful or ugly?
maybe she's beautiful, but she's kind of disgusting. I mean, disgusting because of her behavior. I mean, she's beautiful, but the things that she is doing with others make her horrible and dreadful.
Okay, so for you, your frame is that she is full of hearts and very beautiful. Yeah? Is here anyone who disagrees? Yeah.
I would disagree. She's more, there is this stark contrast between her and her sister, where her sister is beautiful and this classical image of beauty, and she's more of blossom. She's, at least in the movie, I don't remember the description in the book, but she's quite short, so she's quite short and very round, and people usually laugh at her appearance.
So your frame is based on the film. I know what film you mean, yeah? With the Mia Wasikowski, who is Alice in this film. Yeah. But generally, if you think about the description in the book, there is no description at all. No description, no hearts, no red face, nothing like that. But there are pictures by Taniel, and on these pictures, she's not pleasantly looking, to put it mildly. Really, she's full of hearts, and her face is, it's not visible that it is red because the illustrations are in black and white, but it's somehow visible that it's something dark, so maybe it's closer to red, yeah? As you see, there is no description, but the perception of the description is based on non-verbal elements. Yeah? So non-verbal elements are very important, yeah? Sometimes. Or for instance, when List Mikita was translated by Bogdan Melnik in the 80s. By the way, if you want to have a look, we have a lot of these List Mikitas at the department because Bogdan Melnik, some 20 years ago, brought, I think, 5 boxes of his book to us, and we still have some of them, a lot of them actually. I don't remember the quality of this translation, but what is very good, there are a lot of illustrations by Eduard Kozak. I wonder whether you've heard this name. He was the most popular cartoonist in Halachina between the First and the Second World War. And then he moved to Canada, and he illustrated this book. And it's very useful for the non-Ukrainian readers, particularly for children, because they can see all these realia, там peach, вышиванка. So everything is done in a very detailed and user-friendly way. So here illustrations also enhance the perception of children who read it in English and know nothing about the Ukrainian realia. Okay, so you also analyze lexis, sentence structure. If it is a poem, it's very important to analyze suprasegmental features, stress, rhythm, rhyme, etc. So everything you can find in this text. It depends on the text. And finally, this is something you may either use or skip. So on the basis of all this, Christiane Nord indicates the general strategy. According to her, the general strategy is either documentary or instrumental. You may use these terms, or you may use more common terms like foreignizing approach or domestication or adaptation approach. It's very close to that. So if it's documentary, you mean that you perceive this original as a document. You try to stick to its semantics. If it's instrumental, you can manipulate it to a slight or to a greater degree. Yeah? And that's how you deal with this text. Yeah? So you start with the translation procedures, and then you may outline the general translation strategy. I guess that's it. Do you have any question? Is everything clear?